Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 29 Malta International Conference. We'll be starting off in 5 minutes' time. Thank you.
A pleasant Saturday morning to all delegates and welcome to the second plenary session. This plenary session will run from 8:20 to 9:30 p.m. My name is Dr. Azlina and I will be your moderator for this session today. A gentle reminder to all the delegates before I introduce our speaker for today, kindly post your questions or comments for our speaker at the box at the bottom of the screen and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We are very honored to have with us this morning Mr. Gordon Lewis from Oxford University Press, USA. Mr. Gordon Lewis founded the ELT Strategies in 2019 after serving for 11 years as Vice President at Languages for Laureate Higher Education. He became Academic Director of Kaplan English Programs based in the New York City from 2004 to 2008. From 2001 to 2004, he was the Director of Instructor Training and Development for Burmese Kids in Princeton, New Jersey. He ran a language school in Berlin, Germany from 1990 to 1999. He earned a Bachelor in Science in Languages and Linguistics from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C., and obtained his Master's in Science from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, Monterey, California. Mr. Gordon has served on the committee of the IATEFL Young Learners Special Interest Group and served as an editorial board member of ELT Journal. He is co-author of Games for Children and Grammar for Young Learners. He is also the author of the Internet and Young Learners, Teenagers, Making the Most of Technology and Bringing Technology into the Classroom, which are all published by Oxford University Press, USA. He is a sought-after public speaker who presents at conferences around the world. So I believe we are very privileged to have him with us this morning to talk on the topic, planning for the new normal. Signing in from Princeton, New Jersey, USA, I now welcome Mr. Gordon Lewis. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just bring up my slides for a moment. Here we go. Let me make my slides here. One sec. So, thank you so much, Dr. Azlina, for the kind words and the introduction. As you said, I'm in Princeton, New Jersey, USA. Many of you may know Princeton, New Jersey, because we have a quite famous university in our town. But for those of you who may not be familiar with Princeton, just to let you know where I am in between two big cities, New York City and Philadelphia. It's really an honor for me, though, today to speak to you in Malaysia, because I have a history with Malaysia. My family lived in Malaysia for 5 years in the 1980s when my dad was director of International School of KL. And I walked and bicycled and drove across everywhere in peninsular Malaysia, with fond, great memories at all times. So this is something special to me and something very personal that I have a chance to chat with you all today. So today I'm talking about the new normal. But the reality is, over the past week since I began writing this presentation, is that we're still not there yet. I'm sure you all know that we're having another push of the virus spreading through the countries around the world. And so we are still in a stage of some lockdown, some not lockdown. But the reality is that moving ahead in the next coming months, we do need to start thinking about what happens after we get some control of the pandemic as we have it here. And so today, what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about where we were and talk a little bit about the kinds of things that I've been seeing over the period of the pandemic and working with a lot of different organizations and helping them transition to online. So what can we first say? The interesting thing and the positive thing is that change can happen. We were put to the test. We had to solve this problem, and we were able to do it. We were able to adapt. And that is a good thing. And that shows that when you put your mind to it, you can break through the hurdles of large organizations, hurdles of reluctance of staff to embrace things new. Because of the urgency that we had, we show that we're capable of this, and that's a very positive thing that's emerged from the last year and a half. But the question that we have to ask ourselves as we move forward is, how do we sustain the innovations that took place here over the last year and a half? How do we keep that energy alive? Are we going to retreat back to our previous ways of working? I would argue that that's probably not going to be the case. But clearly, we have to address the question there of what is going to happen once we emerge from a crisis situation. As you can see here on my second bullet, we came in when this happened, no preparation, no real roadmap on how to deal with this. So we had a crisis response, and everybody pulled together to get learning happening again online. But now, as we move ahead, we have to move from that crisis response to what you can call, or a colleague of mine called it, Andy Hockley, a man who works a lot in the area of ELT management. He talked about change management in this case. So we need to go from crisis management to change management, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit and see what that could mean for us. We need to be proactive instead of reactive now. We need to predict in the future, but we know a lot more now, obviously 18 months later, than we did when this started. And we can apply these lessons. We can learn from what has happened. And I would encourage you in your context, if this is possible, is to think a lot about that, to maybe even conduct some solid research into what has been happening, if possible. I know many organizations that I've spoken to have been trying to do that, so that we can capture these lessons, because sure, this isn't going to be the first challenge that we confront as we move on with our careers. But the good thing, change can happen, and we got the job done as best we can. But where were we just pre-pandemic? I just thought it would be interesting to talk about some of the things that I was hearing that I felt were being quite important in the world of English language teaching before March of 2020. And the first one that comes to mind for me is the globalization of English. Over the past years, there's been large discussions in our industry about the role of native speakers versus non-native speakers. And as English spreads to become a language which is embraced across the entire world as a method of communication, ownership of English in the traditional sense, with those traditional English-speaking countries, including, of course, Malaysia and India, for example, but also obviously the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, etc. This is starting to change. And this was something that was very visible to me over the last years. Now, with the pandemic, of course, very interesting is because although we are international and globalized, everything is happening within our little box now. So actually, what interesting happened with the pandemic was that the geographies of English and the localization almost disappeared into the little Zoom box, and I think in some ways it balanced the playing field in that area, and gave people the opportunity from all over the world to essentially be able to work in an even playing field in that regard. But as we'll see, that wasn't the case for every aspect of learning. The other thing that I think that was very much debated just before the pandemic started was the notion that I call technology in search of pedagogy. And what I was seeing over the years was the more sophisticated the technology became, the more not backward looking, but the more traditional our teaching philosophies had become in the larger scale. I think there was an inverse relationship that once you had automation, once you had video, once you had all of this, we tended to fall back on the other side to traditional ways of teaching, presentation, practice, performance. A lot of what I was seeing of what you could call drill and kill. So we were not changing our teaching philosophy at the same speed that we were adding new technology tools to our arsenal of possible things that we can use. So I think we were at a tipping point at that point of trying to understand, how do we go to a new generation of teachers coming from training colleges and explain a pedagogy of language teaching that is technology driven. I don't think we were there yet, but I think that the pandemic certainly has forced us to reflect on that, and it's certainly obviously not going to go away. So it needs to be addressed, and I think another positive side was that by being forced to confront it head on, it has made us make some decisions. Language becoming inseparable from the other core skills required to succeed in the global marketplace. This has been something also that I think is very prevalent, is that the idea of teaching English in isolation from the other subjects that one might learn has changed. We have English as a core skill in much the same way we have critical thinking or creative thinking, and much the same way we have math, science, social studies. But the interesting thing about it is, with language, of course, is that it's not only the core skill, it's not only the subject, but it's also the medium through which to teach it. And I think that's a big challenge for us as teachers of English, because it's asking us to be almost subject matter experts and language teaching experts at the same time. So these were four things that I thought were really right at the center of our thinking before the pandemic struck. Now, turning to the technology, I put down here some of the things on the technology side that I felt were really front and center in people's thinking as they relate to language learning. So, and obviously, when we look at this in terms of the situation we find ourselves in, you can see that some of these have become more critical. Others maybe are not as front and center right now than they were before. Now, certainly mobile first tools, being able to learn the way that we conduct our communication in our daily life via our cell phones. This is a very important aspect of post-pandemic work or pandemic work, because what we will see is that not everybody has the same access to the internet, to technologies, and but in most of the world, if you do have access, it'll come first from your phone, and therefore mobile first became a central, shall we say, a central element of any solution for teaching languages online. As before, it was an appendage, and we were thinking about it, and some people were very convinced of it. Others were just playing with it. Now, with the pandemic, the mobile moved much more front and center. And so did blended learning. And I'll talk about this a little bit later as well. But blended learning, and blended is a large term, and it can include many different things, including flipped classroom models, whereby we ask the students to access content on their own. And then we come into class and we work with the students to practice the learning that they did on their own, and to help them with questions they may have, etc. Flipped classroom models are hard to implement, and so not all blended classrooms are flipped. But what we do see is that the idea of having a balance between, in the case of classroom instruction or home instruction and virtual instruction, this is something that obviously was paramount. We couldn't do it any other way. And now, as we move forward past in the post-pandemic, we need to take a look at that, and we need to consider, okay, if we're going, are we going all the way back? Are we just going to return to our classrooms? Or does this blended idea of having some digital and some non-digital, does that still have a role for us to play? And if so, how? Augmented and virtual reality, I think we're still on the frontier of this. It's just beginning. I see in the marketplace that there are numerous new solutions that have emerged, and we're starting to see that that what was once a little bit unwieldy to use in language teaching, and frankly, in my opinion, a bit of an abstraction, a distraction in certain cases, is now becoming much more user-friendly. So I think it hasn't been something that has been immediately necessary to implement in a crisis, but I certainly think that this is an area of technology that has reached its maturity, and we'll be seeing more of it. Gaming and badging is completely integrated in education in the broader sense within universities, and certainly in the corporate sphere where you're learning adult education. And we're seeing more of this in the ELT world as well. So this continued and was strengthened. Adaptive and personalized learning. So this has to do a lot with the notion of machine learning and the ability to serve content to students in a way that matches their needs, be it either a testing solution or even just practice exercises and the like. Adaptivity and personalization is absolutely essential in this environment that we find ourselves 100% online, and certainly distributed across across the world. So that's huge. And one other thing about adaptive and personalized, this also has a lot to do with collecting data. And the one thing about all of us being online all the time is that we can capture a lot more data about the learning, or let's just say we can do it a lot more easily than if we had a classroom environment where we would have to arguably do a lot more observation and capture that by hand. Now we have a lot more information about our learning going on, and that again is a very important factor as we move into the new normal, is to learn the lesson of that. Is how can we take all this information and convert that information into knowledge about our students and about the learning. Social broadcasting and networking, we all know that this is a powerful way for our students to to really see language at work in real time. And the way that gets integrated is something that I think needs to be captured in a systematic way. I know we have great innovative teachers that are doing all kinds of different projects like this, but in some circumstances we have systems where the social broadcasting or the networking is built in. But I think this is an area that we can continue to build on further. The ability to fully integrate the social into the learning environment is huge. And then finally, anytime, any device, all learning is saved and shared between devices. Again, this is the question of not only access, but of data as well. So these were the pre-pandemic trends that I saw, and this situation with the pandemic either pushes them much forward, or as we can see in a couple, stalled them a little bit as well. The reality, though, is that the notion of change has changed. As simple as that. We used to have strategies to adapt to change. Oftentimes they were long journeys within an organization. They were planned centrally. They were linear, point 1, point 2, point 3. And we would put them together, and then we would write a document. It would get passed by the organization, and we'd say we renew that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Well, the pandemic has completely, in my opinion, destroyed that model of change management. We do not know what is going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 months. And therefore, we have to disassociate ourselves from the notion that we can plan ahead in that same way. There's a departure from permanence, I like to call it. What I mean by that is that we are constantly needing to reorganize things. We're constantly needing to question. I call it dynamic self-organization or creative destruction. What I mean by that is oftentimes we have a shall I say, a natural inclination that if we make something, we want to keep it. Yeah, be it a lesson plan, be it an approach to learning. But in this new world here, where we have to adjust incredibly quickly, we need to also be willing to discard something that's not working, create something new. And we have this cycle that we'll look at a little bit more in a second, which will allow us to be agile. I don't like that word because it's used so much nowadays, but I think it fits here. We need to be agile. We need to be able to move with a lot of quickness to deal with issues. But the reality is that, people don't have anything against change. Change is good. Everybody likes change, whether you're going to, as I put here, whether you're moving your house or you're getting married. Most people like change, but people are not so good at transition. And I think this was a big challenge of the pandemic, and something that we can learn from it was that in the pandemic, we didn't have the good fortune to worry about transition. Transition was forced upon us, and we simply had to deal with it. And we know that transition brings with it some sense of loss. When you move your house, you're going to miss your former house. If you get married, you're going to miss maybe having those freedoms that you could just go out anytime you wanted and, decorate your house the way you want. You lose some of these attachments. You lose some control, the identity and the structure. But in an emergency situation like we just had, we had to buckle down. We had to get over that loss. We had to get over it quickly. And I think that this is whatever lessons we can take from the pandemic is how we handle transition moving forward. Because what we want to be able to do is to give ourselves the ability and the confidence to continue to move ahead once crisis has been replaced with some semblance of normality. So what did we do in the pandemic? Essentially, we all got together as people as humans, and we harnessed our human intelligence here. Okay, and I define human intelligence here as the ability to think, to learn from experience, to solve problems, and to adapt to new situations. And we did that, and we can be so proud of what we did there. But for the most part, this was done ad hoc. This was teachers getting together and solving problems in real time with little guidance in many cases. Some organizations, of course, did try their best to foster this, but a lot of what went on was just, this is the spur of the moment. We got to solve this right now, and we used our intellect to do that. So moving ahead, I would argue is once we know that we have the human intelligence to capture and solve the problem, we need to develop systems intelligence. And I think this is the challenge as we move into the next phase here, is what I call human intelligence at scale. So the ability of a system to vary its or their state or action in response to varying situations, varying requirements, and past experience. So how do we apply the lessons of what we as individual teachers and administrators experienced to our overall system or learning ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, our school, our university, our corporation, whatever it may be? How do we apply that and turn that inspiration and that innovation into a structured approach to change moving forward? That, I think, is the challenge that we have, but we have so much experience that we've gained over the past 18 months that we can apply to this, that I'm very confident that what emerges is going to be great. It's interesting, though. I wanted to show you this slide. This is a slide I show when I'm doing teacher training, and it's based on the top graph that you see there is called the hype cycle, and it's what they call the Gartner curve by the name of the organization that founded it. And so, as you can see, in the case of technology, what you have is oftentimes a technology is introduced and people have very, very high expectations about that technology, and they just go straight out of the ballpark up into the sky to what we call the peak of inflated expectations. So we get the technology, we get so excited about it that we actually attribute more to it than maybe is realistic. And what often happens immediately after, a few months or whatever amount of time of using that technology is that we get deflated after a while, because we realize, well, the technology can't solve all the world's problems all at once, and we have this trough of disillusionment, they call that it is called, where you're kind of at the diametrically opposed level of expectation, and sometimes technologies just simply disappear at that point. But what does happen over time in normal days and normal situations is that we slowly but surely build up our knowledge about that technology and as it relates to the way we want to teach. And with that, we build up a base of best practice, you can call it, know-how, which we call the slope of enlightenment. And slowly but surely, we figure out how to use those technologies until we reach what we call the plateau of productivity, where the technology is being used to its fullest potential and it's fully integrated in the learning that you have. I like to always laugh, that we talk about technology as if it's something completely new, but, we have pencil-based technology, right? Or pencil-based language learning, book-based language learning, but we would never call it that. But we do have the technology-based language learning. And the reason that we have that is because we we have a much faster time in which these technologies come into our life. But we, at the same time, we have a lot of time in order to, if we're doing this properly in the way that we have professional development, we had a lot of time to get the organization ready and to go through these stages as we see here. And that leads to the bottom of this slide, which is just another way of looking at it, is the looking at it from the standpoint of the people who are using the technology. So you have the innovators. Those are the ones that probably have the peak of inflated expectations. They love all new technology, and they go out there and they try it out and they figure things out, and they become early adopters, okay? And then once the early adopters are there, you can see that there is the chasm. Yeah, and the chasm applies to the is the same thing as the trough of disillusionment. It's where the early adopters get separated from the early majority, where after a certain length of time, of course, we're starting to bring more of the organization on board. Then there's the late majority and what we call the laggards. Those are the people who, and they're simply people that are not enamored by certain technologies and therefore don't really use them. But I show you this because none of this applies to what we experienced in the pandemic. None of it. And this is the big difference, is that we didn't have that time. There's no peak of inflated expectation, no time for a slope of enlightenment. We had to get it on and get it on fast. And so all of this got scrunched together, and we essentially were able to overcome what in some ways is just simply a natural reaction to change. If we go back to what I talked about a few slides before, and essentially flatten these curves. So there were no early adopters. Everybody had to adopt the solutions in order to get the job done in the pandemic. And that, I think, is something that's going to fundamentally change the way that we work in our schools, especially in the way that we look at technologies. We're going to realize that we don't have this kind of time, and so that's going to change not only what we adopt, but also how we train our students, our teachers moving forward. So we need to be resilient. We need to be able to have a situation, another situation like this, a big disruption, and we need to have system in place where we can be resilient and where we can be flexible. We do not have the time to take a product and pilot it and 2 years later introduce it. We're in this constant cycle here that I show here, where we have a goal. That goal faces reality. At that point, we have options, and we need to make quick decisions around those options. We make those options, and that's our way forward. And then the cycle happens again, okay? And the point here is it's not about being perfect in what the solution is that we have. I say here a terminology I use: sprints to minimal viable product. So let me explain what I mean by that. In product development these days, many people work with what one calls an agile approach to development. And what happens in these agile approaches is that the development is broken down into these generally 2-week sprints, where you have very clear goals within those 2 weeks. And so therefore, every 2 weeks, you're reflecting on what happened in the 2 weeks before, adjusting what you're doing for the next 2 weeks, and incrementally improving on your product as time goes. And I think in the pandemic, it was necessary to work that way, and it forced people to become agile, even if it wasn't a strategy that was sort of looking for, that was planned. It's something that just happens because of the nature of the context that we were in. But that's a good thing because it allows us to iterate in a different way. And I think you'll see publishers, of course, are using this agile approach as well. But for us as educators, it just means that we have to understand that we don't have the time. We have to be in there every day, readjusting, rethinking, and this is going to be the permanent approach that I think we have in the future to how we conduct our work. The other thing I think that we've seen in the pandemic that is so important is the pivotal role of teachers. With all the technology out there in the world, the teacher has been the deciding factor in making the programs that we have through the pandemic successful or not. And that is something that I've seen over and over again in surveys that I'm working with different institutions. They all say the same thing when you have the teacher surveys. Yeah, we like the technology. It's really fun. I enjoy the online activities, etc. But I really, really love my teacher. Yeah. The teacher fosters the engagement that you need in order to succeed online. And it's not easy because online is not a given. And even though we say, we have our younger learners or our younger teachers now have grown up with technology, that does not necessarily mean that is a great motivator on its own for students or teachers alike. There needs to be a form of engagement, and it's the teacher who provides that. And in this online environment that we have, in this new world, the teacher role has gotten much more complex. So the teacher is a mentor, the teacher is a motivator, teacher can be a creator, a guide, an evaluator, and or expert learner. The teacher has to provide linguistic and non-linguistic information because the context in online can never be as full as the context in a face-to-face environment. We are in these boxes, and I'm in one right now. I can't see it, but I'm in there, and you can see me in it. But what I can't see is you can't see is what is on my left and what is on my right. You don't know that there is a dog underneath my table right now. Okay, these are the kinds of things that I think really impact and make learning online difficult for teachers to manage, and therefore we're putting a lot of burden on the teachers here, and training needs to reflect that moving forward. You see, because machines can't do this, because I would argue machines don't have consciousness. They cannot talk about and predict student feelings and motivations. The systems, the technologies, the AI gives us great information, great data about the learning, but they can't reflect on that data. And we realize that in the case of 100% online education, that while we can use a lot of this data to help us in what we choose to do in our classrooms, there are decisions there that we need to use that human intelligence, and nothing can replace that. So what I like to say there, and I think this is a good takeaway from the situation that the pandemic has brought us, is that technology is not a better teacher, okay? I always say to teachers previously, don't be fearful of technology taking over your job, because it can, okay? Some organizations may try that, but generally speaking, the word of the students will be clear that they need that bond to the teacher. But technology done appropriately can make teachers better, in the sense that we're giving the teachers more tools. We're giving teachers more opportunities to take advantage of the natural skills that we have as living, breathing human beings in the classroom. So teachers, this is one of the big takeaways. The teacher becomes even more important in this pandemic situation. Automation versus augmentation. Just again, I put it in here. Technology is not a better teacher, but technology can make teachers better. I like this analogy of the referee at a football match. Yeah, he's still the referee, but he's using that VAR technology in order to make him an even better referee. Okay. And I think this is the takeaway here when we're looking at the technologies and we moving into the post-pandemic world, is let's look at those technologies and think about it. Which of these technologies will improve student learning? But from a teacher standpoint, which technologies can I use that can make me a better teacher? I think the other thing about teaching in the pandemic and where we're emerging is that we are definitely moving more quickly than before from a teaching to a coaching environment. Okay. And what is a coach versus a teacher? So I put a few things up here that Luca Lampiarello, who has a website, he put these things up here. And I think they're good here. What is a language coach? He's somebody who helps you find the most efficient and effective learning schedule. He helps identify the most useful tools, resources, and methods that will help you achieve your goals. Give you worthwhile assignments and missions designed to grow your skills. Keep you accountable when you're struggling and thinking of giving up. Very, very important in this pandemic where people were so isolated. Use his or her skill to give you feedback on your own skill development, guide you through every stage of the learning process from absolute beginner to highly advanced, and provide encouragement and moral support whenever you may need it. I think the pandemic showed how important all of these things are. We can use flipped classroom models in the online. Students can access content. They can get a YouTube video of a teacher explaining a concept. And that works fine, like the Khan Academy, if those of you are familiar with that tutoring platform. We can do all of those kinds of things. But we cannot, through the technologies, provide this kind of support that we have right here. So I think one of the things that we can take away from the pandemic here is to further the whole coaching element that we have in our teacher training, and make sure that that doesn't get under-resourced and under-explained in the training that we have. Now, as far as training is concerned, one of the more popular models for training for technology-based learning is called the TPACK model. Some of you may already be familiar with it, but it's a really quite logical model here, as you can see. It's basically a Venn diagram which says in order to teach using these technology contexts, you need technical knowledge. Okay, you need to know how to use the technology. So clearly, if you have a new technology product, you need to have a way that people understand the product, can practice using it, and have confidence in that side of things. Because if they don't, and they're trying to fiddle around with the technology while they're online, where the students are there, it can become quite a difficult problem. Obviously, you need content knowledge. What does that mean? As I said earlier in the presentation, nowadays as English teachers, because we're so much in the core, content knowledge can go well beyond our ability to understand how language works, grammar, pronunciation, etc. No, we may need to see a much bigger picture around certain soft skills, for example, when you're thinking about employability, for example. Language plays a big role there. So we need to be really multidisciplinary in our content. So that is a huge area. And finally, pedagogical knowledge. When we're talking about pedagogical knowledge here, This is where I think the biggest change needs to take place. This is where we really need to ask ourselves, okay, moving ahead in the 100% online environment, what pedagogical assumptions do we have that now need to change? What do we need to teach our teachers that we haven't been teaching them before, that goes beyond the technology itself, but the reason, the rationale behind it, the way in which we can use it to make ourselves better teachers. So this TPAC model, I think, is where we have to go back, and we need then to basically separate those three circles and then start breaking it down now based on the experiences that we've just had. And I would encourage, if you go back to your classrooms or you go back to your organization, it would be worthwhile to take a look at that and then compare your own training to the experience you had in the pandemic, and then perhaps add or alter to make things more effective for the situation at hand, and as we move ahead. And what I mean by that, again, is because the premise is that the online or the digital is not going to go away anymore. It's there to stay in one form or another. It will be there. We are not going to have non-technology infused classrooms anymore. One place I think that's interesting to do this, and something to consider here in solving the problems around the pandemic, is to consider the use of communities of practice. As I said earlier, the way that we were able to get through the pandemic was through our own human intelligence. And the best thing that we can do around that is to bring a bunch of human intelligences together in a structured fashion to solve problems. And communities of practice are designed specifically for that purpose. And I think it's the best way that we can move forward in understanding how to prepare teachers for many changes that we may be seeing in the coming months. For example, what happens if we get other variants and we need to lock everything down again? How do we do that? How do we emerge from that again? Do we have a practice where we can do ping pong from lockdowns to no lockdowns? These are the kind of things that I think we still have to think about. But really here, the interesting thing around this community is it's based on three essential areas. The domain, and that we call that the things that matter. That's what unites all of us as teachers, okay? And as you can see, there's some words in here: common ground, shared identity, shared interest, relevance, value, purpose. This is what unites us. What was interesting in the pandemic was that the crisis unified the domain. We were all in the same boat. Yeah. And this doesn't matter whether you were in Sarawak or you're in Philadelphia. Yeah. The unique thing was that we all had the same challenge. Doesn't matter the locality. Yes, there's questions about access to technology and things like that, but ultimately the problem, the domain, remained the same. So the whole world was a community of practice. But that's important to establish your domain, and then you have the practice that goes with the domain, and that is the area where you want to capture what did you do to solve the problems when you were in the middle of this pandemic? Did you see any other examples outside of your organization which would be helpful to your organization? Some of the words that go with this: stories. I think stories are really important here in emerging out of the pandemic. Tell the stories of what happened. Listen to other people's stories. Stories tell a lot. And stories can be then turned into lessons learned. They can in turn then be turned into processes that are established from them, frameworks, tools, documents, ideas. Capturing all of this knowledge within the community is critical as we move ahead, because we cannot know what's going to happen. So we need to create a base of knowledge that we can work from. And finally, the idea of community, of course, a sense of belonging. Of both the domain and the practice go together with the community interaction. So, how do you talk about it? Yeah, what is? How willing are you to share your ideas? Because you need to want to share them. What is the regular interaction you have? Because let's not forget, all of us were in our boxes and still are, and so therefore the idea of being able to meet in the in the office and share this practice, that has disappeared. So maybe your virtual place is a SharePoint, a Microsoft Teams room, any number of different solutions and possibilities that we have in order to encourage this interaction. This is another thing that I think the pandemic has changed for us irrevocably, is that we are going to continue to be pushing our interactions and our knowledge online. We will go back to face-to-face environments. Of course we will in circumstances, but I think that this idea of community in the cloud, so to speak, communities of practice in the cloud, this is something now that is accepted. The same as the digital resources. So we'll say it has become accepted. It was there, yeah, and some people were using it, but now it's become mainstreamed and it's accepted in its approach. So, but there are some problematic things that we've seen here through the pandemic. And one of them here, as I say, are we teaching to the few? I think this is a really big problem for us as teachers and educators in general. Looking at this, I like this the thing that I took from Fairmont State University website. These are the things that they say are essential to being a successful online learner. So I am self-motivated and self-disciplined. I'm able to work independently with little direction. I have good time management skills that allow me to schedule specific times throughout the week to work on my online course. I can effectively communicate any questions or concerns. I am not a procrastinator. I will not miss the face-to-face interaction. I don't give up easily, and I'm comfortable spending 5+ hours each week on a course to review course lectures, videos, etc. This was for a university, of course. Now, I can tell you one thing's for sure, that is not me. And I would argue that a lot of people would not be able to say that they are all of these things. So it's a challenge for us to be able to develop the skills in our learners that they need to be successful online. And I think this has been the most difficult aspect, in my opinion, of the pandemic, not just for language teaching, but for education in general, is how do we develop support strategies and learning to learn strategies for our students in this kind of situation. Now, of course, here, again, we didn't have the time to think it over. Okay, we just had to get in there and do it. And through instinct, our own experiences, we made it work. But a lot of kids suffered through this, especially in the high school, junior high school, and in primary. Primary students need time to build up their basic learning skills, and then to add this onto it is just was a daunting task, and it is not something that has been resolved. Let's also not forget the parents. Yeah, we then had parents who were then responsible for having to take care of these kids and support their learning at home, since we didn't have a physical classroom anymore. These parents are not necessarily equipped to do these kinds of things. These parents have to work, and maybe they can't be there all the time for them. So I think what we're seeing here is that there's a lot of disparity, okay, in the with the technology. And it's funny because pre-pandemic, we always would say that technology is the great equalizer. I think that the pandemic has shown profession education. I like this from Tressie McMillan here from Virginia Commonwealth University. She's speaking about problems in the United States with race, of course, but she says, when learning online, it still matters very much who one is. Social disadvantages of being Black, female, poor, and or having a physical or intellectual disability do not simply disappear when one learns through the internet. I think what the pandemic did was it exposed and deepened the divides in our society and in our education system. Here in the United States, it's really shocking in some places what has happened. If you live in a neighborhood that is less resourced, your children were really lost. Some children lost an entire year of school. I think we found that this was much more complex than we imagined. And it's the biggest challenge I think that we have now is how can we support learners in this kind of situation? Because one other word on that, the thing about it is that we don't have the ability to get to them in each of their spaces there. So essentially, what will happen is where the learning has already been very good, the online is successful. Where the learning in the past and the resources has been bad or challenging, it continues to be challenging, and therefore the divide grows. Okay, so this is a big problem that we have, and we haven't solved this yet. The bigger, in my opinion, probably the biggest problem we have. So finally, I know I'm getting close to the end of time. I just wanted to talk quickly about blended learning. I think blended learning is what's going to bridge the past and the future. It combines the best of both worlds. Okay, what's happened, I think the difference now is that we did blended learning around the world, and some people did more of it, some people did less, but it still wasn't 100% mainstream. But now, after the pandemic, the idea of a digital component in learning, be it digital course books or other resources, that's here to stay for good, and therefore blending that. Maybe going back to a physical classroom, but also having this digital work. This is, I think, what we're going to be seeing in the future. It's not about the book versus the digital. The digital is right in the center and mainstreamed. And whether you go to a flipped classroom model or not doesn't matter. You can still have presentation, practice, performance models as well, but the digital is here to stay, and the pandemic, that's a positive of the pandemic, that it's pushed it forward and it's accepted now, I would argue. Lots of different models of blended, but basically I just wanted to point to model 4, which is what we dealt with, the fully online model. And there, even if we're fully online, it still is blended because we have the difference between synchronous learning, like we're doing right now in the Zoom classroom or whatever system we're using, and asynchronous learning, what we do outside of those classrooms with our students. And that is the interesting area that we can consider as we move forward for training and development of our programs. How does the teaching reality change based on how we manage 100% online, asynchronous, and synchronous in environments? We can do it, and we will, and we may have blended environments where you have a face-to-face component, but I think we're going to need to deal with both, and they will be anchored by the digital assets as opposed to the course books in the future. So finally, in closing, where are we now? Some conclusions. We're in permanent transition, and that's not going to change. So we need to get used to that. It's just going to be constantly changing. It's going to be quick, and we're going to have to adapt. And so all the things that we talked about, we have to try and bring that into a systemic approach to dealing with that change. The technology doesn't need to the pedagogical change unless it's part of a broader commitment to a changed paradigm. So we need to think about that. Can we commit to a different way of working as we move out of this pandemic, or will we slide back? As we just said, technology has the highest impact in places where effective teaching already takes place. So how do we solve the problem of making the technology work in the areas where the people are not advantaged as in some other places. It's not evenly distributed, but if done right, I think it could have the potential to relieve some inequality. And finally, blended learning models are proving to be the most effective models that we have. So that's what I had to say. Just a bit of a train of thought kind of idea, and I'll open this up for questions, I think, if anybody has some. So if I'm not mistaken, somebody will let me know if there's some questions to answer.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon, for such an enlightening session. I believe you have already set us thinking and reflecting on our own practice with the current pandemic, and how we should actually embrace or actually handle the transition itself. And I believe teachers around the world are still struggling to do so. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, we have, yeah. So we have, I'll give you one question first. Teachers' roles has changed tremendously, with the pandemic. So what would you advise teachers in their way forward to cope with the uncertainty of the pandemic that the pandemic has actually imposed on them?
So I think the first thing I would point to is that idea of creating that community of practice, so that you can create it within your organization a set of best practices that will guide you in these situations. And then the other thing is, I think, is this idea of moving away away from being just simply the sage on the stage, so to speak, the expert, and focusing on the facilitation, and realizing that in this situation, that the learners are isolated and can be alienated. So it's the focus should be about support, I think, here. That would be my biggest takeaway there.
Okay, we have time for another question. The assumption that all students are connected is complicating the teaching and learning process. Should we abandon online platforms and make instructions through radio and television, as well as snail mail correspondence, the primary mode of instruction when we have students with no internet access, which is actually what we face here in Malaysia as well? So should we be more concerned about students with no access to technology rather than focusing on those who actually have access?
That's a great question. And I think I touched on it a little bit when I talked about the inequalities that the technology is bringing up. I think it's huge. And I think, yes, you need to have other solutions to get to the students if the internet connectivity is not what it's supposed to be. And if that is through television, which I know is happening in many countries, that they moved in that direction. Or like you're saying, yeah, even the snail mail approach, I think there's nothing there that is not up for consideration. It's clear we don't want to leave those students behind. So yes, I think we need to look at all of these options, and remember that technology. Anything that we use with our students is in a sense a technology. Yeah, there are more sophisticated technologies and less sophisticated technologies, but we got to use whatever we have in order to reach them. So yeah, use all of them, in my opinion, would be what I say.
Okay, one last question. What does it take to move from the pedagogical content knowledge zone to the TPAC zone? Is formal training necessary, or do teachers move seamlessly into the TPAC zone over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a structure to be used in a teacher training environment. So what you would do is you would break that down into the different elements that you would need to train people up on in those three respective circles. So that gives you the the basic training there for working within a technology environment. But again, I think it needs to be connected to the community as well. And in fact, that is oftentimes in teacher trainings that I've developed is what I've always asked the teachers to do, that they be working on trainings that are based on that TPAC model, but their expression, their tasks and everything are in the community, so that they're from day one, they're generating solutions to the problem.
Okay, thank you. I think we have come to the end of the plenary session. Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon, for such a good sharing to all the teachers. I'm sure should the session be extended, more questions will be pouring in. So on behalf of Melta, I would like to extend our sincere thanks and gratitude to you, Mr. Gordon Lewis, for making the time to be with us this morning. I believe it's late evening in the US at the moment, right?
It's getting there. It's still early, 9:30.
All right. We look forward to more future collaborations.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
And don't hesitate to get in touch, everybody. If you have questions, just shoot me an email. You can find my mail online easily.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
All right,
you.
one announcement to the delegates. For delegates who have registered for track 3, you can begin to log in before 9:50. So with that, I wish you all a fruitful conference day. Thank you.